In the 1st century AD, two empires ruled the world: Han China, Rome. Same scale, same strength. Barely aware the other existed. Both fell. Rome fell once and never got up. Han China fell a dozen times and came back every time. Here is one of those falls. 分久必合，合久必分. What has long been divided must unite. What has long been united must divide.
天下人，禀报洛阳。就是这柄宝剑。天，令你两家罢兵。喂，难道忘了辕门射戟？辕门射戟！今天下英雄，文使君与操。鸟上青天，鱼入大海，再不受其报。我魏国凯愿于万军之中举起手旗来献城下。一旦得知皇叔去向，关某定必先上。4点了，不合所谓。
That is the pattern. The empire fractures, millions die, a new dynasty rises, and then it happens again. This is not a story of failure. This is a story of a civilization that could not be permanently killed. Rome never had that.
In the 1st century AD, two empires ruled the known world. Han China, 60 million people, 4 million square kilometers of territory. The Roman Empire, 50 million people, 5 million square kilometers of land, comparable in scale. Both threatened by nomadic peoples pressing from the north. Both faintly connected. Through silk, through rumor, through trade routes, neither empire fully understood. The Book of Later Han, China's official dynastic history, once described Rome with a reverence it rarely extended to any foreign civilization. Its people are tall and upright in bearing, resembling the people of the Middle Kingdom. For a dynasty that regarded nearly all outsiders as barbarians, this was a remarkable act of civilizational respect toward a world it had never seen. And yet, two empires so alike at the starting line ran toward entirely different destinies. Both collapsed, but Han China collapsed and came back again and again and again. Rome fell once, and Europe never found its way back to unity. This is not a story about which empire was greater. This is a story about how a civilization survives the weight of itself, or doesn't. on a theory of power. That theory determines everything. Han China ran on a machine, a bureaucratic engine of extraordinary efficiency. The emperor sat at the top. Below him, a civil service selected through merit recommendation, deployed through a grid of commanderies and counties that stretched from the Yellow River Basin all the way to the edge of the Tarim Basin. The ideology was Confucian. Hierarchy was natural. The emperor held the mandate of heaven, and the entire social order was one vast interlocking moral system. The genius of this machine lay in its capacity for absorption. It did not require consensus. It required compliance, and compliance accumulated across generations became identity. The clearest proof came from an unlikely source, the conquerors themselves. In the late 5th century, Emperor Xiaowen of the Northern Wei, a ruler of Xianbei origin, a people who had swept into northern China from the steppe, ordered his own aristocracy to adopt Chinese surnames, wear Chinese dress, and speak Chinese at court. The man who had defeated China chose to become China. The machine had digested its own conqueror. Rome ran on something older and stranger, a contract. The Republic had already lasted 5 centuries before the emperors arrived. Rome carried in its bones the memory of checks and balances. The Senate retained formal legislative authority. Emperors governed as princeps, first among citizens, not as kings. And beneath all of it, Roman law, not the emperor's will, not heaven's mandate, a body of rules that existed independently of whoever held power, protecting private property, enforcing contracts, constraining arbitrary punishment. Trajan, one of Rome's greatest emperors, was born in Spain. Septimius Severus came from North Africa. The system did not care where you were from, only whether you obeyed the law. This single difference, moral authority versus legal authority, would echo through everything that followed. Han China believed commerce was dangerous. Merchants were taxed double, barred from public office, and subject to systematic official suppression. The state monopolized salt, iron, and liquor. What the machine needed, the machine controlled. In a crisis, this arrangement created a temptation that proved impossible to resist. When Emperor Wu needed money to fight the Xiongnu, he did not raise taxes. He invented currency. Officials cut white deerskin from the imperial hunting park into 1-foot squares, decorated them with paint, and declared each piece worth 400,000 bronze coins. Princes attending court were required to purchase one as a ceremonial mat beneath their jade discs, legalized robbery dressed as ritual protocol. Wang Mang went further. In 15 years, he reformed the currency 4 times, declared shells and tortoiseshells legal tender, and forced citizens to exchange their gold for government tokens worth nothing. Workshops collapsed. Merchants vanished. The dynasty he founded lasted 15 years. Rome's financial death was slower and in some ways more terrifying for its slowness. Under Augustus, the silver denarius carried 95% pure silver. Nero reduced it to 90% to fund the rebuilding of Rome after the Great Fire. Under Marcus Aurelius, 75%. By the peak of the 3rd century crisis, this coin, which had underpinned Mediterranean trade for generations, contained less than 5% silver. Some emperors simply minted copper coins with a silver wash. In Egypt, wheat prices rose tens of thousands of times within a few decades. Emperor Diocletian responded with the edict on maximum prices, fixing the cost of thousands of goods by imperial decree. The result: black markets, merchant strikes, total failure. A scene that would replay itself with the same logic and the same outcome in planned economies 2,000 years later. Two empires, two collapses, one sudden and violent, the other slow and irreversible. Empires do not only fail at the top, they fail in the bodies of the people who carry them. In Han China, the crisis had a sound and a color: yellow. Zhang Jue spent more than a decade moving through the countryside as a healer, secretly building a religious network called the Way of Supreme Peace. In 184 AD, his followers, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, rose simultaneously across 28 commanderies in 7 provinces, heads wrapped in yellow cloth, with a slogan that cut to the bone: "The blue sky is dead. The yellow sky shall rise." This was not chaos. It is a political declaration. Chinese peasants, even in their deepest despair, believed the mandate could change hands, that a better emperor was possible. They were fighting towards something. Rome's despair ran deeper. There was no yellow sky to march toward. From the 3rd century onward, the bankrupt farmers, escaped slaves, and deserters of Gaul and Spain coalesced into armed wandering bands, the Bagaudai, who raided estates, evaded taxes, and refused military service. But they had no program, no vision. Many simply walked away from Roman civilization entirely. When Germanic tribes crossed the frontier, some Roman peasants welcomed them, reasoning that barbarian warlords might prove kinder than Roman tax collectors. One civilization's poor fought to replace the emperor. The others had stopped believing in emperors at all. When the old order fractures, people reach for the sacred. Buddhism entered China at its darkest hour, carrying a message perfectly calibrated for suffering: that poverty and pain were the residue of past lives, that suffering had meaning, and that every soul, slave or aristocrat, held an equal claim to liberation. Equality. In a civilization built on hierarchical ritual, that single word carried the quiet force of a detonator. Christianity spread through Rome's underclass by an entirely different method. Its weapon was not doctrine, it was presence. Early Christian communities fed the hungry, nursed the sick, buried the poor with dignity. During the great plagues of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, when Roman elites fled the cities, Christian communities stayed. They cared for strangers. They sat with the dying. That kind of practical solidarity was something no Roman institution had ever thought to offer. The difference in how each faith ended up matters enormously. Buddhism in China was ultimately absorbed into the system, woven into the Confucian Buddhist Taoist triad that served imperial authority, powerful in its reach, but never permitted to rise above the throne. It became a tool of power. Christianity in Rome replaced what fell. When the Western Empire's body died in 476 AD, the church was still standing, inheriting its administrative apparatus, its legal traditions, its educational institutions, becoming the only institution that stretched across all of fractured Europe for the next 1,000 years. One religion became a tool of power. The other became power itself. Every empire eventually faces the same temptation to solve a military crisis by handing the army to someone else. In 188 AD, the Han court, exhausted by the Yellow Turban Rebellion, granted regional governors the right to raise their own troops. It seemed like a practical solution. It was a detonator. Under the old system, conscripts served the emperor. Under the new system, soldiers served whoever paid them. Cao Cao's men were Cao Cao's. Sun Quan's men were Sun Quan's. When the warlord Dong Zhuo marched his Liang province army into the capital, deposed the emperor, and burned the city of Luoyang to the ground, he was only following the new logic of power to its natural conclusion. The Han emperor became a prop, a costume worn by whoever commanded the most soldiers. Rome's version was stranger, and in the end, more fatal. As the empire's finances collapsed, Roman citizens stopped volunteering for the legions. Rome made a strategic error it could never undo. It invited the enemy inside. Germanic tribes, Visigoths, Vandals, Franks, were settled within the frontier, given land and wages, and asked to defend what they had previously tried to destroy. They were called foederati, allies. They kept their own laws, their own chiefs, their own weapons. In 376 AD, a Roman border official began selling rotten dog meat to starving Visigoth refugees, extorting slaves in exchange for food. The Visigoths revolted. 2 years later, at the Battle of Adrianople, they killed Emperor Valens on the field. The myth of Roman military invincibility died that afternoon. In 410, Alaric's Visigoths sacked Rome for the first time in 800 years. In 455, the Vandals returned. In 476, the Germanic general Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. He did not claim the throne. He had no use for it. Han China's warlords fought each other for the right to sit on the throne. Rome's barbarian generals took the throne and threw it away. Both empires built their frontier defenses on a grand theory of separation. Han China built a wall, or rather, a system. Thousands of kilometers of rammed earth and timber across the steppe frontier, with beacon towers capable of relaying signals across hundreds of kilometers within hours. But the wall was not merely defensive. It was a forward operating base. Emperor Wu's armies launched their deep strike campaigns against the Xiongnu from the wall, supplied by soldiers who farmed the land immediately behind it. The frontier was a launching pad, not a last resort. Rome built along rivers, the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates. Where rivers failed, it built in stone. Hadrian's Wall, 117 kilometers across northern Britain, cutting the island into two worlds. But from Hadrian onward, the strategic philosophy shifted fundamentally. No more expansion. The limes became a finish line, not a starting line. Rome was guarding what it had, no longer reaching for more. Both walls fell for the same reason. The empire behind them could no longer pay the soldiers standing on them. The difference is what crossed over. The peoples who pierced the Great Wall eventually became Chinese. The peoples who crossed the Rhine became French, German, Italian, nations that would never again gather under a single roof. How each empire handled the foreigners within its borders may be the single most consequential difference of all. Han China's strategy was the melting pot, patient, systematic, and sometimes brutal. Surrendered Xiongnu were settled on the frontier, monitored by imperial commissioners, drawn into Confucian education and agricultural life. The sons of foreign elites were sent to study at the Imperial Academy in Luoyang. The goal was never coexistence. It was conversion. The long-term returns were extraordinary. When the 5 barbarian peoples swept into northern China in the 4th century, they did not dismantle the system. They competed to enter it. The Xiongnu ruler Liu Yuan declared himself a descendant of the Han Dynasty. Tuoba Hong of the Xianbei mandated Chinese surnames, Chinese dress, banned his own language at court, and relocated his capital southward to absorb Chinese civilization. Invaders became Chinese. The short-term costs were brutal. Eastern Han officials sold the Chang people they governed into slavery, triggering nearly a century of revolt that drained the treasury of hundreds of billions of coins, destabilized the entire Northwest, and ultimately produced, among other things, the warlord Dongzhuo. Rome's early integration was arguably the most sophisticated political experiment the ancient world had ever attempted. In 212 AD, Emperor Caracalla declared that every free person in the empire was a Roman citizen. Citizenship was not blood, it was law, it was identity. For centuries it held. Then came the late empire's most catastrophic strategic miscalculation. Facing the Hunnic advance, Rome allowed entire Germanic nations to cross the frontier intact, with their chiefs, their armies, their laws. No commissioners, no academies, no patient dissolution of tribal structure. Only a contract: defend the border, receive payment. When the payment stopped, when corrupt officials traded rotten meat for slaves, the contract meant nothing. The Visigoths at Adrianople were not rebelling against Roman culture. They had never been invited to adopt it. The core difference: Han China melted its foreigners into a culture powerful enough to absorb its own conquerors. Rome bound its foreigners with interests, not identity. When the interests collapsed, so did everything built on them.
Two empires, two legacies. Neither one simple, neither one clean. Han civilization's capacity for unity is one of history's most astonishing achievements. Its cultural gravity was powerful enough to absorb conquerors. Even when dynasties died, the civilizational DNA reassembled. But that same power had a cost. It repeatedly suppressed the heterodox voices that might have generated institutional innovation, pruning away the seedlings that could have become mechanisms for self-correction. Rome's republican inheritance and legal tradition became the bedrock of modern Western political civilization, not during the empire's lifetime, but a full 1,000 years after its fall. But Rome's genius for law and plurality also had a cost. It was built on contract rather than cultural identity. When the contracts broke, the civilization shattered and found no way back. We live in both of their shadows. China inherited extraordinary cultural cohesion and a long-running deficit in institutional self-correction. The West inherited law and competitive pluralism and a growing hollowness in shared cultural identity. Perhaps the true maturity of human civilization lies not in choosing one legacy over the other, but in being clear-eyed enough to take from China's inheritance its cohesion and leave its despotism, to take from Rome's inheritance its rule of law and leave its fragility, and to build towards something neither civilization ever managed to reach. History will not give us the answer, but it will keep precise accounts of what every choice costs. This is Kong Su's history. In the long river of time, what we are searching for is the fragile, golden path toward freedom.